Imagine waking up to the smell of smoke on the most magical night of the year, Christmas Eve, 1945. For the Sodder family, this nightmare became a reality. Their West Virginia home was engulfed in an inferno, so sudden and fierce it seemed almost deliberate. George and Jennie Sodder watched in horror as their house and everything they held
We have to get out of here.
ash in under 45 minutes. When the fire was finally out, investigators sifted through the rubble, expecting to find the remains of the 5 children trapped in the attic. But they found nothing. No bones, no teeth, absolutely no trace. The official story was that the fire was hot enough to vaporize the bodies, a claim experts say is impossible. But strange clues hinted at something more sinister: a missing ladder found discarded, phone lines deliberately cut, and trucks that wouldn't start. Was this a tragic accident or a meticulously planned abduction disguised by flames? Hello, and welcome back to Behind the Mask, where we peel away the layers of the world's most disturbing true crime stories. Today, we are traveling back to the post-war era of 1945 to examine a mystery that feels like a nightmare written for a movie, but is tragically real. This is not just a story about a fire. It is a story about a conspiracy, the Italian Mafia, and a parent's undying hope that defied the official narrative of the police and the government. We are going to dissect the case of the Sodder children. We will look at the forensic impossibilities, the strange visitors who threatened the father months before the tragedy, and the sightings of the children that continued for years after that fateful Christmas Eve. This case is a labyrinth of dead ends and shocking revelations, and it challenges everything we think we know about how investigations were handled in the 1940s. It is a story that touches on the darkest fears of every parent. The idea that your children could be stolen from their beds, and the world would simply tell you to forget them. Before we light the match on this investigation, I need you to join our community of detectives. If you enjoy deep dives into the unexplained and the mysterious, please hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. We are building something special here, and I don't want you to miss the next chapter. Also, I want to know where you are joining us from today. This story takes place in the small town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, but mysteries like this happen all over the globe. Pause the video right now, go down to the comments, and tell me, what country and city are you watching from? I read every single comment, and it's fascinating to see how far our voice reaches. Are you ready? Let's step behind the mask of the Sodder family mystery.
To Leibniz, into Gabay one to like for any creatin you need a Robin. This is the moment it all began. The fire that changed everything.
The Sodder household was a place of abundance and noise. George and Jennie Sodder were Italian immigrants who had worked incredibly hard to build a life in America. George owned a trucking company, hauling coal and earth, and they had 10 children. The house was a large 2-story timber frame building located about 2 miles north of Fayetteville. On Christmas Eve, 1945, the atmosphere was thick with excitement. The oldest son, Joe, was away serving in the Army during World War II, but the other 9 children were home. The evening began normally. The younger children were thrilled about their gifts. Marion, the eldest daughter, had bought toys for her younger siblings with her own pay. The family celebrated, ate candy, and listened to the radio. It was the quintessential picture of the American dream: a large, happy immigrant family, safe in their home on the holiest night of the year. Around 10 p.m., Jennie told the younger children, Morris 14, Martha 12, Louis 9, Jennie 8, and Betty 5, that they could stay up a little later to play with their new toys. But they had to make sure to close the chicken coop and feed the cows before going to bed in the attic. George, tired from a long day of work, went to bed early with the 2 oldest boys. John and George Jr., Jennie took the youngest child, Sylvia, into the bedroom with her. The house gradually quieted down as the excitement of the evening gave way to the silence of the night. At 12:30 a.m., the silence was broken. The telephone rang. Jennie woke up and went downstairs to answer it. On the other end of the line was a female voice she didn't recognize. The woman asked for someone whose name Jennie didn't know. In the background, Jennie could hear the clinking of glasses and raucous laughter, as if a party was in full swing. When Jennie said, "You have the wrong number," the woman laughed a weird, sharp, cackling laugh that would haunt Jennie for the rest of her life, and hung up. Jennie found the call odd, unnerving even, but she dismissed it as a prank. However, as she walked back to bed, she noticed something that annoyed her. The lights in the living room were still on, and the curtains were not drawn. Usually, the children were very responsible about the chores. She assumed they had simply fallen asleep quickly after their late night. She turned off the lights, closed the curtains, and returned to her bedroom. She noticed that the attic door was unlocked. But again, she was too tired to investigate further. She had just begun to drift back to sleep when she heard another sound. It was distinct, loud, and came from the roof. It sounded like a heavy object hitting the shingles, a hard bang followed by a rolling noise, like a rubber ball or a heavy rock rolling down the slope of the roof. It stopped with a thud. She listened for a moment, holding her breath, but heard nothing else. Dismissing it as ice sliding off the roof, she went back to sleep. Half an hour later, at 1:30 a.m., the nightmare truly began. Jennie smelled smoke. She shook George awake, and they ran into the hallway to find the office filled with flames. The fire wasn't just burning, it was roaring. The fuse box was not the source, yet the fire seemed to be moving with a strange, aggressive speed. George and Jennie screamed for their children. The four who slept downstairs, John, George Jr., Marion, and little Sylvia, woke up and rushed outside. They stood in the freezing winter air, the snow crunching under their bare feet. They looked up at the attic windows, expecting to see the faces of the other 5 children: Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty. But there was no movement in the attic windows. The staircase that led up to the bedrooms was already a wall of fire. George, desperate and filled with adrenaline, tried to rush back inside, but the heat was unbearable. He shouted their names, over and over, his voice cracking against the roar of the flames. The house was burning from the inside out, but strangely, the Christmas lights that were strung around the porch were still on. This was a crucial detail. If the fire had been caused by an electrical short, as the police would later claim, the power should have been cut instantly. Instead, the lights illuminated the tragedy, casting a surreal glow over the panic as the parents realized their 5 children were trapped in the burning attic. George Sodder was a man of action. He was not going to stand by and watch his children die. Realizing he couldn't go up the stairs, he formulated a plan instantly. He remembered the heavy ladder that was always kept leaning against the side of the house. It was long enough to reach the attic window. If he could just get the ladder, he could climb up, break the window, and pull the children out one by one. He ran to the spot where the ladder was always kept. It was gone. He searched frantically in the dark, sweeping his hands through the snow, checking the nearby grass. It wasn't there. It made no sense. The ladder had been there every single day for years. With precious seconds ticking away and the fire growing louder, he had to abandon the search for the ladder. His next idea was to use his coal trucks. George owned a trucking business, and 2 of his trucks were parked right next to the house. He thought if he could back one of the trucks up to the wall, he could stand on top of the cab and reach the attic window. He sprinted to the first truck, jumped in, and turned the key. The engine cranked, but it didn't catch. He tried again. Nothing. This was inexplicable. The trucks had been driven the day before. They were in perfect working condition. He jumped out and ran to the second truck. He turned the key, praying for the engine to roar to life. Silence. Both trucks, on this specific night, at this specific moment, were dead. It was as if they had been tampered with. Desperation turned to horror. George looked around for water. The rain barrel, usually a source of emergency water, was frozen solid. The temperature was bitter cold. Every tool, every vehicle, every escape route that George tried to use was failing him. It felt orchestrated. It felt like a curse. Meanwhile, Marion, one of the daughters who had escaped, ran to a neighbor's house to call the fire department, but she couldn't get through. The operator wasn't answering. Another neighbor saw the flames and drove to a nearby tavern to call from there, but again, no response. Finally, someone had to physically drive into town to the fire chief's house to alert him. Despite the fire station being only 2.5 miles away, the fire trucks wouldn't arrive until 8 a.m. the next morning. By then, the sun was up and the house was gone. The family had watched helplessly for 45 minutes as the structure collapsed into the basement. The roof caved in with a sickening crash, taking the attic and, presumably the children, down into the inferno. George, his hair singed and his heart broken, stood by the smoking ruins. He had tried everything. He had tried to be the hero, the protector, but unseen forces had stopped him at every turn. The missing ladder, the dead trucks, the frozen water. It was a perfect storm of bad luck, or a perfectly executed plan of sabotage. As the dawn broke, the remaining Sodders huddled together, shivering not just from the cold, but from shock. They stared at the pile of ash that used to be their home. They were waiting for the firefighters to begin the grim task of recovery. They were bracing themselves to see the bodies of Morris, Martha, Louie, Jennie, and Betty. But deep down, George felt something was wrong. He knew fire. He knew coal. He knew how things burned. And looking at the pile of debris, which wasn't even that large, he couldn't understand how 5 human bodies could simply disappear. The fire had been intense, yes, but it had been brief. The house fell quickly. There should have been something left. When the fire department finally began to sift through the ashes on Christmas morning, the expectation was grim but straightforward. They were looking for bones. The human skeleton is incredibly resilient. Even in high-intensity fires, the skull, the teeth, and the long bones of the legs do not simply vanish. They might fracture or shrink, but they remain as calcified evidence of a life lived. The firefighters, led by Chief F.J. Morris, poked through the debris for a few hours. They found remnants of the house-twisted metal, broken appliances, parts of the roof tin, but concerning the 5 children, they found nothing. Not a single bone fragment, not a tooth, not even the smell of burning biological material, which is distinct and pungent. Chief Morris, perhaps wanting to spare the family further trauma or perhaps hiding his own department's incompetence, told George and Jennie that the fire had been hot enough to completely incinerate the bodies. He suggested the children had been reduced to ash. The local coroner convened a jury later that day, and they quickly ruled the deaths as accidental, caused by fire or suffocation. The death certificates were issued on December 30th. The case was effectively closed by the authorities. Less than a week after it happened, they wanted the Sodders to bury their grief and move on. But George Sodder could not reconcile the official explanation with the laws of physics. He began to do his own research, turning his grief into a relentless investigation. He discovered that a modern crematorium burns bodies at 2000 degrees Fahrenheit approx. 193 degrees Celsius for about 2 hours. Even after this intense, focused heat, bone fragments always remain and must be pulverized by a machine to become the ash we are familiar with. The Sodder house was a wood frame structure. It burned for 45 minutes. The wind was blowing. It was physically impossible for that fire to maintain the heat required to vaporize 5 skeletons. To prove this to himself, George conducted a morbid experiment. He visited a local crematorium and asked questions. He even killed animals and burned their bodies in a makeshift fire to see what would happen. Every time, bones remained. He also recalled that amidst the ashes of his home, they found kitchen appliances still recognizable. If the fire wasn't hot enough to melt a toaster, how could it vaporize a human skull? Then came the discovery of the liver. During a later search, Chief Morris claimed to have found a human heart in the ashes. He packed it in a box and secretly buried it. When George heard this, he demanded it be dug up. A funeral director examined the heart and discovered it was actually a piece of fresh beef liver that had never been exposed to fire. Why would the fire chief plant fake evidence? When confronted, Morris admitted he had buried the beef liver to placate the family, to make them believe the children had died so they would stop asking questions. But this lie had the opposite effect. It proved that the authorities were hiding something. If the children were dead, why fake the evidence? The lack of remains was the first domino. It suggested that Maurice, Martha, Louie, Jennie, and Betty were never in the attic when the fire took hold. If they weren't in the fire, they must have been taken out of the house before it started. The fire was merely a distraction, a way to cover the tracks of a mass kidnapping. George and Jennie were now convinced their children were alive. They remembered the strange phone call. They remembered the thud on the roof. They realized that the thud was likely a primitive incendiary device, a pineapple bomb, thrown onto the roof to start the fire. The children hadn't burned. They had been stolen. Once the theory of kidnapping took root, the Sodders began to look at the events leading up to Christmas with a new perspective. They realized there had been warning signs, threats that they had ignored. Months before the fire, a stranger had come to the house looking for work. He walked to the back of the house, pointed to the fuse box, and told George, "This is going to cause a fire someday." George was puzzled. The wiring had just been checked by the power company and declared safe. Around the same time, another man tried to sell the family life insurance. When George declined, the salesman became angry. He shouted, "Your goddamn house is going up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed. You're going to be paid for the dirty remarks you have been making about Mussolini." George was an outspoken critic of the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, which was a controversial stance in the tight-knit Italian immigrant community of the area. At the time, George didn't take the threat seriously. After the fire, a telephone repairman gave the family a shocking piece of information. The phone lines leading to the house hadn't been burned through by the fire. They had been cut. Someone had climbed the pole and used pliers to sever the line to ensure the family could uncall for help. This proved premeditation. This wasn't an accident. It was a tactical assault. Why would a fire accident involve moving a heavy ladder? It was moved to prevent George from saving the children, or perhaps, used by the kidnappers to enter the attic and take the children out before the fire was set. Witnesses began to come forward. A woman who ran a tourist stop 50 miles west claimed she saw the children the morning after the fire. "I served them breakfast," she told police. There was a car with Florida license plates. Another woman at a hotel in Charleston claimed seeing the children a week later. She said the children were accompanied by 2 men and 2 women of Italian descent, who were hostile and would let the children speak. A bus driver also reported seeing a fireball land on the roof of the Sodder house as he drove past late that night. This corroborated the thud and rolling sound Jennie had heard. It wasn't faulty wiring. It was arson. The pieces of the puzzle pointed to a coordinated effort to extract the children and destroy the evidence. George hired private investigators, but the local police refused to reopen the case. The FBI offered to help, but they needed the permission of the local authorities, which was denied. Was the salesman who threatened George making good on his promise? He heard rumors of a girl in a convent in St. Louis who looked like Martha. He was denied entry, heard of a boy in Texas. He drove all night, only to be disappointed. The family printed flyers with the children's faces. They erected a massive billboard on Route 19, a highway that passed their home. It featured the pictures of the 5 children and offered a $5,000 reward, a huge sum at the time for information. The billboard stood for decades, becoming a grim landmark. It accused the authorities of negligence and pleaded for the public's help. Despite the lack of official support, the Sodders never stopped. They kept the memory of the children alive. They preserved the site of the house, planting flowers where the rooms used to be. But the most chilling piece of evidence was yet to come, arriving in the mail 20 years after the smoke had cleared. In 1968, 23 years after the fire, Jennie Sodder went to her mailbox and found an envelope postmarked from Central City, Kentucky. There was no return address. Inside, she found a photograph of a man in his mid-20s. He had dark hair, dark eyes, and a facial structure that looked hauntingly familiar. It looked exactly like their son Louis would have looked as an adult. On the back of the photograph, there was a handwritten note, cryptic and strange. "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. I love boys, a 90132 or 35. The family analyzed the photo obsessively. The shape of the nose, the tilt of the left eyebrow, all matched Louis. The reference to brother Frankie could have been a code or a reference to a sibling the family didn't know about. Hope reignited in the Sodder home. They hired yet another private investigator to go to Kentucky and find the man in the photo. They paid him in advance. The investigator took the money, left for Kentucky, and was never heard from again. He didn't report back. He didn't answer calls. He, like the children, simply vanished with the family's money and their hope. The family was afraid to publish the photo for fear that if it was Louis, the people holding him might harm him. They added the photo to their fireplace mantle, staring at it every day, wondering if their son was out there, reaching out to them in code, unable to come home. George Sodder died a year later. In 1969, he had spent his entire fortune and the rest of his life searching for his children. He died without knowing the truth, but refusing to believe they were dead. Jennie continued to wear black, in mourning. Until her death in 1989, she tended the garden around the billboard, ensuring that no one forgot the faces of Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty. After Jennie's death, the billboard was finally taken down. The surviving children, now adults with their own families, continued the search, but time was running out. The youngest survivor, Sylvia, who was in the bedroom with her mother that night, became the keeper of the story. She remembered the screams, the smoke, and the cold snow. She passed away in 2021, the last link to that tragic night. Over the years, various theories have been proposed. Some say the children were taken to an orphanage in Italy. Others suggest the Mafia killed them and disposed of the bodies elsewhere, using the fire as a distraction. Some skeptics still cling to the fire theory, despite the lack of bones. But no theory fully explains the cut wires, the missing ladder, the witness sightings, or the photo from 1968. The case remains technically open, but effectively cold. The dirt where the house stood has been excavated multiple times by amateur sleuths and TV crews. They found a few small bone fragments in later years, but DNA testing proved they belonged to someone much older than the children, likely from a nearby cemetery, perhaps moved there in the dirt used to fill the basement. It was another dead end. The Sodder children disappearance is more than just a crime story. It is a tragedy of uncertainty. Death offers closure. A body offers a funeral, but disappearance offers only a lifetime of what-ifs. The Sodders lived in a state of suspended grief, setting a place at the dinner table for ghosts who might have been living just a state away. As we look back at this case from the 21st century, the mystery remains as potent as ever. The image of those 5 children on the billboard is etched into American folklore. They are the children who vanished into smoke. The children who defied the laws of physics. The children who might have grown old waiting for a rescue that never came. The story of the Sodder children leaves us with an unsettling feeling in the pit of our stomachs. It is the realization that reality is sometimes stranger and crueler than fiction. If the children died in the fire, science has no explanation for the lack of remains. If they were kidnapped, humanity has no explanation for the cruelty of keeping them from their parents for decades. The photo sent in 1968 suggests that at least one of them knew who he was, and knew where his parents were, but could only send a cryptic message from the shadows. It forces us to ask, what secrets are buried in the small towns of the past? How many other families were torn apart by threats that were swept under the rug by corrupt officials? The Sodder family refused to let the world forget, and because of their persistence, we are still talking about Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty 80 years later. They are not just statistics. They are the symbol of a mystery that refuses to die. I want to hear your theory. Do you believe the fire was a cover-up for a mafia kidnapping? Or do you think the impossible happened, and the fire really did consume them completely? Leave your theory in the comments below. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to Behind the Mask. We investigate the stories that keep you up at night, and your support helps us bring these lost voices back to life. Until next time, keep your eyes open. You never know what's hiding behind the mask.